David Lammy, the Right Honourable David Lammy, has been in the media and in the news recently due to some of his comments around smacking and parenting and how it could have potentially prevented the riots. David's recently released a book and also has been instrumental in the fight back in his constituency in Tottenham subsequent to the riots. We caught up with David at the LSE and let's see what he had to say.
I think the important place to start is to start with where we are at the beginning of this century. And this first 10 years of this century has been pretty tough. In fact, if you go back to the last century, and I'm not predicting a First World War, you had the openings up of recession, you had real problems in Europe, and you had strong differences of opinion emerging around race and political ideology. And at the beginning of this century, we have had September the 11th, we had the bombings in London, we've had a decade, certainly the first half of this decade, preoccupied with climate change. We had one ray of sunshine with the election of Barack Obama in the United States. We've had huge economic downturn. And if you think about those issues and think about their relevance to BME populations particularly, this is a turbulent period into which I'm having this discussion. And indeed, riot and recession go together. So that's the backdrop. It's a panoptic backdrop. It's an international backdrop, as well as its effect on London more locally. And in representing the constituency of Tottenham, I talk about Tottenham a lot, as you would expect. It's my home. I love it. I care about it. I was raised there. But of course, I could be talking about a lot of other ums. By that I mean Lewisham, or Peckham, or Brixton. Maybe Harlem, or Watts, certainly parts of Paris, Berlin. And there would be other places in the Western world particularly affected in similar ways. So the parochial here has application beyond that. I think it's important to me to draw some contrast between Tottenham as you might have found it in the early 1980s when I was just entering my teens, and Tottenham as you find it today. The Tottenham I grew up in was dominated by 3 or 4 big communities. Caribbean communities, white Cockney kind of former East End communities, an Irish community, and a newly arrived Cypriot, Greek and Turkish community. Tottenham today is over 220 languages, is the most, N15, the most diverse postcode in the country, probably, most definitely, I think, the most diverse constituency in Britain, in Europe, and potentially the world. That's important because some of the caricature of my constituency almost gives the impression that it is solely made up of the 3 communities that made it up in the 1980s, and that is not the case. And actually, that diversity means that there are different experiences of race and the impact of race. Now, obviously, in some of what I have to do, I have to say I'm particularly concerned with parts of the black community in its narrowest sense. But it is to say the context, for me, representing Kurdish Turks, representing Ghanaians and Nigerians, representing Somalis, and representing Eastern Europeans is complex and varied and brings very different kinds of demands and different communities with different capacities, actually. and different traditions. But it is still the case, whether in the 1980s or now, that this is a constituency with amongst the very highest unemployment in London as we speak, with 43 job seekers for every vacancy. It's a community in which 80% of children are growing up in poverty. It is certainly a community in which this debate that we are having today in the House of Commons about the working poor and about their access to housing is extremely pertinent, because my constituents are usually doing two jobs. They are a cleaner and a dinner lady. They are a security guard and a minicab driver. And actually, I shall come back to what that means in terms of not just a living wage, but what that means for your ability to be there for your parents, for your children, even if you are doing the very best that you can. And I don't think that that context has changed. In some ways, I think it's got worse since the 1980s. It is profoundly sad for a community like Tottenham, and indeed for our country, that we now have a few places in the country that have seen 2 riots in a generation. And that is hugely sad for the people that live in those communities. For me, it's been particularly poignant on 2 levels. It is hugely depressing to see some caught up in the riots in the 1980s, sometimes imprisoned or criminalised as a result, to see their children caught up in riots 20 years later. When we, on the centre-left, talk about the scars of not getting employment right, of not getting education right, of not getting opportunity right, of not getting the balance in relation to racial justice right, I saw those scars this summer. But it is also a huge problem that despite the concentration on one day in August, the vast majority of people in my constituency stayed at home. 26,000 young people stayed at home. And much good has been going on and is going on in my constituency, in different neighbourhoods, in different buildings, in schools. In fact, we got the best GCSE results this year, the best A-level results this year. And it's hugely important that in balancing this discussion, we don't stigmatise areas like Tottenham such that there can be only one narrative, only one stereotype about what is possible. And I say that with great sensitivity because I remember what it was like applying for jobs with an N17 postcode and worrying about whether you would be interviewed because people assumed that you were from a tough area or a rough area or you were caught up in the riots and therefore they didn't want you. And that has obviously a huge effect on young people. So I think the context for where we are, despite similarities, is slightly different. It's different because the riots that we saw this summer involved more than just one race. It's different because the issues, I think, behind the riots are more than just about the initial wounds that create riots. It's different because actually the policing, we saw a massive vacuum on this occasion that allowed people to pour into an area from way beyond that area with their own intentions. And therefore, for me, the book that I have written, Out of the Ashes, and let me just get on record, all of the proceeds going to charities in Tottenham, not to me, attempts to look right across the range of issues that I think are relevant. And tonight I will try and touch on some of those issues. But what we do know is that the majority of rioters were young. The vast majority of rioters were male. In fact, over 90% of the rioters were men or boys. And clearly, with a high, or amongst the highest unemployment rate in the area, this must have been pertinent. And if we look at the stats, despite some of the positives, particularly for parts of the community, we see the double hit. So black people 3 times more likely to be out of work. Black Caribbean boys 3 times more likely to be permanently excluded than their peers. In 2009, despite the progress made in the last government with going to university for young people from inner city areas, and in Tottenham it went up 100%. In 2009, there were more black British students at one London university than the whole of the top 20 Russell Group universities put together. In fact, a young black man is 3 times more likely to end up in prison than in the lecture halls of a Russell Group university. And then alongside that, an underlying issue that I return to, as difficult as it is, and that is that 65% of black Caribbean children are being brought up by a lone parent. This has financial implications, if nothing else, but I'll return to some of the others implications as well. So where are we in 2011? I throw those statistics out to, I hope, give some sense of the complexity, I think, as to where we are. And also to say that, or to push this point, that yes, some of those issues will be down to discrimination and racism, but it is clear to me that not all are. It is clear to me that we are in a place where we have also to look at different levels of resilience, capacity, cultural norm within community, as well as what would be the traditional race dimension. To put this in simpler terms, the 2 big battles, if you like, on a social justice level of the 20th century were equality and inequality. We have clearly, under the law, made some progress on equality, most definitely, with 2 Race Relations Acts and with a very different context in Britain to my father arriving here in 1956 and seeing, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs on the doors of some of the housing he would have liked to have got. Massive progress in the employment market as well. So clearly, under the law, there has been progress in relation to equality. And that's not just for black and ethnic minorities, progress for gay men and women, progress for women as well in relation to equality. But yet there's still more to do. And there will be many in this audience that think that stop and search is one of those more to do. There will be many in this audience who will think that the inability for the Metropolitan Police in a diverse city like London to look like Britain is more to do. But equally, in a recession, after a year of growth, or a period of growth, sorry, it is also clear that inequality is back on the table, and that we have to be as preoccupied with inequality as we are with equality. And that is inequality for lots of people, whatever the colour of their skin. And then I think alongside inequality, there are broader issues, cultural issues, that I would want to return and to challenge, and that's often to do with modern culture as well as individual racial cultures. But let me just be clear in relation to the riots and racial discrimination. History tells us that riots usually start with a spark. They usually start with some profound sense of injustice. In fact, whether you are looking at Watts in the States, or the Paris suburbs, or Brixton, or Birmingham, or Bradford, or indeed Tottenham, it usually starts with someone dying, usually at the hands of the police. And that was the case, obviously, in the summer in relation to Mark Duggan. And not just the death of Mark Duggan, but what we now recognise as some of the subsequent misinformation that didn't accord with people's understanding of Mark Duggan that was put out shortly after his death. I'm not going to go into detail about the death of Mark Duggan, because it would be inappropriate for me to do that when there is an IPCC investigation looking at that issue, except to say that within the battle for social justice, and looking at those who find themselves the most vulnerable in that battle, it is clear that with 300 plus deaths in custody over the last decade, and really a sense that no one has been prosecuted for that, that feels like a serious injustice. And whilst I think there has been progress since the old police complaints authority that ran into disrepute, it's clear to me that with Tomlinson, with Smiley Culture, and now with Mark Duggan, the IPCC and the confidence it needs to command from minority communities is at a profound turning point, and much is expected of them, and many are concentrating their scrutiny on whether this body is actually the body that feels like it represents all of our interests. And of course, that is because, in a sense, this comes on the back of Scarman, it comes on the back of Macpherson, it comes on the back of the very clear knowledge that black people are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched, Asians twice as likely, but the arrest rate for those stopped is less, or not even 1% higher than white people stopped or searched. And the truth is, again, this is not straightforward. I do not agree that this is the same as the old sus laws. And the reason I don't agree that this is the same as the old sus laws is because I recognise a pitched battle back in our history in the 1970s, early 80s, between what felt like a very oppressive police force and the black community, particularly black youth. I think today the new ingredient is knife crime. And having sat with so many parents who've lost their kids to knife crime, it is hard, and if those parents were here, or many were here, it is hard not to recognise that the urgency and the political pressure that's been brought to bear to do something about all these knives on the streets. Now, you can then talk about whether that doing something in the shape of stop and search is actually effective. But nevertheless, I think the context into which we see Section 60s and notices and this acceleration is slightly different. But I also think that what's actually important is that I believe passionately, and I have spoken to the new commissioner about this, and I welcome his new attitude to these issues, and I was here for his lecture a few weeks ago. I believe passionately in a model of policing that is based, one, on community policing, which I think is a major advance of the last decade or so, but two, also on policing by consent. This is not America. This is not France. Our police do not routinely carry guns. And if you like, police by fear, because if you've got a gun, it's a very different policing model. We have policing by consent, and I would want to stand up, and I suspect everyone in this audience would, and defend that model. But there is a big but. At this turning point in our history, in this very multicultural global city, looking at this audience here in one of our leading world universities, I have to say an audience that is wonderfully representative of London, you have to ask yourself how you're able to have that model working to full effect if the institution is not representative of the community it serves. And so I think it's unacceptable that with 32,000 officers, we have 868 black officers. That is not sufficient progress. We do need a Met that starts to look more like you would expect if you were on the streets of New York. And that is because you need that inbuilt trust. And let me say also that beyond just racial diversity, I want to see more Londoners in the Met, of whatever colour. Young people, men and women that have grown up in Camberwell, in Brent, in Pimlico. I worry that current practice on travel and on housing is leading to a situation where the overwhelming, and I recognise the Met is our national force, but the overwhelming amount of officers are coming from Surrey, from Hertfordshire, from Kent, from other forces, because I think that also that means that London loses that sense of a force that's for itself. And I think that that also plays into who is stopping me and why they're stopping me, and who is making this assumption that I am doing something wrong or that I'm carrying a knife. I think that that is particularly relevant, that issue of trust, and then, of course, of leadership. We do need more than just 3 black chief superintendents out of 73. We do need more than 8 black superintendents out of 176. We need more than 22 black chief inspectors out of 391, it seems to me, in London. Race and discrimination then, but also, of course, not just issues of equality, issues also of inequality, if you like, and challenges going forward. And in this time of economic downturn and tremendous pressure, my sense is that we are at a crossroads. we can repeat some of the mistakes that were clearly made in the 1980s, or we can recognise and learn from that period, and even in tough times, get some of these issues right. I would say we should be very, very worried that the areas predominantly that saw rioting have amongst the highest unemployment in the country. Very worried indeed. We should be very worried that too many of our young people are currently really on the dole, at home with very little to do. It's not rocket science that when the summer comes, it's not healthy to have young adult men with nothing to do. And it's interesting that in the 2 wards around Tottenham High Road, we have in Northumberland Park Ward, around the Spurs Stadium, the highest unemployment in London. And of course, if we link it with Tottenham Green Ward, those wards, not now constituency or borough, but those wards have higher unemployment than the entirety of Nick Clegg's Sheffield Hallam and David Cameron's Witney constituency in Oxfordshire. That is an issue. And my strong view is that the work programme is not sufficient, partly because what people need is work, not training to get work that doesn't seem to be there. And I had a little set 2 on question time about these apprenticeships, because again, whilst that is used as a line, the reality of those apprenticeships doesn't seem to be coming through in constituencies like mine, certainly not in the sorts of numbers that mean that you should laud it like it's going to make a difference. My own view is that it was a mistake to get rid of the Future Jobs Fund, because a lot of the young people I was seeing on that Future Jobs Fund had a black and ethnic minority profile. And they were occupied in the voluntary sector, in the public sector, doing things and moving on. And the absence of that and the youth contract not having started is deeply, deeply worrying. And of course, the fear that this youth contract will feel and look like the old YTS scheme. Some of you will remember the old YTS scheme that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So unemployment, we should be very, very worried about the levels of unemployment we are seeing in communities. And because this isn't the 1980s, unemployment is not just relevant to young adults, absent and struggling in the employment market. Of course, immigration being with us and having been with us for some time, when I talked about the complexity of the community I represented at the beginning, it's also important for me to stress the intergenerational complexities. When we talk about the black community, we have a black community of first-generation immigrants, arrived here in the Windrush period, of second-generation immigrants, not immigrants, a second-generation part of that community, like myself, born, raised, 1970s and 80s. And then we have third generation. And some of them were some of the people we saw on the streets. And actually, employment is affecting all generations. It is still the case that where there is employment for BAME populations, it is largely in the public sector. And guess which sector's being cut? So mum and dad are unemployed, and then children coming up are also unemployed. That takes us, actually, to a very, very worrying place. I actually think in the context of London in the 80s, it was not quite that bad. It feels more like some of the issues you saw in the north of England, in towns where whole industries had been lost, parents had lost work, and young people were coming up without work. And we know the effects of that in cities like Middlesbrough, Hull, parts of Newcastle, Gateshead, Salford, and actually the huge amounts of money that have had to go into those areas to try and regenerate, to deal with that long-standing scar. So real issues in relation to inequality as well. But I, in my book, essentially have a simple premise, and that is that the 20th century, in terms of ideas, had two big revolutions. One, well, both were liberal revolutions. The first, of course, the social liberal revolution of the 1960s, and the second, the economic liberal revolution of the 1980s. And in a sense, in 2011, we are living with both the successes of these revolutions, but also the challenges of these revolutions. The economic liberal revolution of the 1980s has clearly ensured that British politics no longer talks about abolishing capitalism, but about giving people a stake in capitalism, or responsible capitalism, how we civilise capitalism. And indeed, the socialist vision was actually one of civilising capitalism. It wasn't about abolishing capitalism. We would hand that to our communist and Marxist friends. Socialists wanted to civilise it and were concerned particularly about employment rights as a way to make that happen, and then the welfare state as a way to create an insurance against the ravages of that capitalism. And of course, the social liberalism, many in this room would feel deeply committed to, because it was the fight against racism, the fight against sexism, the fight. I was being reminded the other day about the first Stonewall marches in London and the beatings that those men and women received for standing up for their rights. I think it was in the mid-60s, and the advances that we have made. So huge progress there. But whilst we are less judgmental of one another, it feels to me in 2011 that we are less compassionate, we are less civil, and supportive of one another. That the two liberal revolutions combined and unchecked have sold Britain short. We may be less judgmental to one another, but clearly we are living in times that have ushered in a new era of hyper-individualism. A my rights culture, seen as the freedom to say absolutely anything you want, however nasty, horrible that is in this new environment. Reducing and a reduction, I think, sometimes around issues of race to solely an issue of language. Let me defend Alan Hansen. Alan Hansen struggling on Match of the Day. You could see his brain working. Shall I say black? Oh, no, doesn't feel right. Coloured. Oops. And a phrase that actually began as a inclusive phrase may feel pretty old if you're in London to use the phrase coloured, but nevertheless, a phrase used at a point in time as a way of not saying other words that were not very nice, like Negro, is then used against him. Diane Abbott, similarly. And what I mean by that is that human understanding that people sometimes make mistakes and that we have to allow a space where someone can apologise and we can move on. And actually, some of the profound challenges that still exist in our society, the sorts of challenges that lead to murder, and we recognise some progress in relation to the death of Stephen Lawrence as I say that. The profound challenges that still exist in relation to the employment market merit wider and deeper discussion and policy solutions. We should not allow, particularly sometimes actually on the left, a shrill debate that reduces this to a very narrow, almost politically correctness that is solely about language. It is much deeper, much more complex, and it seems to me if we lose our tradition for compassion and humility and sorry I made a mistake, then we lose dialogue. And losing dialogue runs counter, ironically, to a liberal, civilised tradition. And of course, I don't need to tell this audience about the real challenges that exist in relation to that second revolution, the economic liberal revolution. And how that sense of economic freedom has led to gross inequalities in our countries. Over the last decade, the poorest 10% have seen a drop in real wages, whereas the richest 10% have seen a 37% increase. 80% of the increase in national income over the last decade has gone to people with above average income, and the wealthiest 10% are as rich as the poorest 50%. CEOs of banks continue to be offered millions of pounds in bonuses when it is clear that the staff cleaning that bank or keeping that bank secure is not yet able to make a living wage. The ravishes and the trouble that economic liberalism has got into, it seems to me, at this point in our history are profound. And I posit these two liberalisms because I think they present real challenges in relation to race that need to be further explored. I do not pretend I have all of the answers, but add a deeper complexity than solely a debate about racism and discrimination. Part of what I saw and I wrote about in my book, when I see people smashing and running down shops like JD Sports, is a my right entitlement culture, helping myself. Part of what I see from certain industries, it exists certainly in the music industry. It exists certainly in parts of the sports industry. Indeed, when the chief exec of JD Sports said it's fine, it shows our brand is doing well. Seems to me that there we have social, cultural norms played out and repeated, particularly to certain communities, that are deeply problematic. And part of it is the resilience. You can't ban, obviously, advertising and other things, but it's the resilience to hear but not totally absorb, and to have a diversity of influences coming in to your home. I say to my young cousins in Edmonton, you know, what is all this grime and gangster rap blaring out of the TV day after day, hour after hour, when there are 700 channels on the television station. But of course, in the modern society, it's very easy to live in that silo. Some of you will live in a Radio 4 silo, a Guardian silo. It's still a silo. So that is a new complexity, very different set of challenges to the 1980s affecting our community. And those are cultural. And they feed, I believe, and play on a kind of liberalism that says anything goes. And I'm not sure anything does go. I think we have to have a healthier debate about some of these issues. And I wanted to explore that across society at large. And I do want to challenge cultural norms within parts of my own community that do think it is acceptable and fine that 67% of Afro-Caribbean children are growing up with just one parent. It can't be fine. It's not fine socioeconomically, because one income is never as good as two. Simple. And it is clear from all the psychological evidence that young men finding peer group and finding masculinity in peer group relates to gangs. And so there are big issues within community for addressing that and for being responsible if you have children. Understanding the commitment you have to make long term to the lives of those children and the financial support and love that those children need. And understanding that some of those cultural norms that may have been appropriate in previous eras, in previous countries, with large extended family, do not work in London. And I've taken a bit of stick for saying this, but it is the truth. And you can't lay that at the door, it seems to me, of other people until you've been willing to address those issues yourself without, of course, stigmatizing anyone growing up with a lone parent. And let me say, I was raised by one of those tough, strong, beautiful black women, and I am hugely proud of all that she did to get me here. So, in terms of policy solutions, it is clear to me that many of the debates we are currently having have a strong BMAE face. The debate in Parliament today about a benefit cap is about the working poor. It is not about scroungers. It is about people who are security guards and dinner ladies and cleaners who need that top-up to care for their children and have housing. And the exodus that they will be making over the coming weeks from inner London to outer London, and the overcrowding we already have in Tottenham doubling over the next period. And as I've said before, we will see in London scenes similar to what we see in Paris, with all the social consequences of that in the years ahead. I said it first. I'm very sad to have to say it, but it's obvious that that's what it will lead to. Massive overcrowding of young people in homes that are already overcrowded. It's why also, by the way, let me just put on record, I did not suggest. I've written a book of over 250 pages. I did not suggest that the riots were solely down to smacking. But I did say that one of the issues that my constituents raised with me is smacking, because their reality is that overcrowding. Their reality is that estate with the drug addicts in the stairwell and the needles and the condition. Their reality is the knives and the gangs outside the window. Their reality as a parent is making that decision about how they help their children navigate those boundaries. And so I am deeply concerned that parts of the liberal left want to shut down that debate. They don't want to hear my constituents raising these issues. So let me just put on record, if you live in Muswell Hill, in a 5-bedroom house, and you're a journalist, yes, you can run upstairs when your kids make noise. My constituents, or many, can't make that decision. And actually, the truth is, there are things that they fear that are much greater than a smack. And that is the issue that I was putting on the table on their behalf, because that is my job, and I stand by the decision to do that, whatever people may feel about the rights and wrongs of smacking. And again, this is the context into which we have to be clear about the policy decisions that we are making and about the impact on people once we have made those policy decisions. And, you know, I've heard what the NSPCC put out in a statement wanting to see the banning of smacking, but I have to say to them, I wish they hadn't pulled out of Tottenham last year, because they did. And they need to be there on that stairwell with that parent if they're going to make decisions like that, it seems to me. I don't think that we should be handing, as the government is handing, £9 billion of private money, or public land, into private developers' hands, because I do believe that housing remains the critical issue in London, affecting black, Asian and minority communities greatly. And we do need a community land trust, ensuring that there's affordable housing. We need a seriousness about the housing shortage in this country, and we need to recognise how relevant this is to the pressure that can build up, it seems to me, in constituencies like mine. And when we talk about employees on the remuneration committees of these companies, again, let's see the face of who those employees are. Let's think about the CEO of that supermarket earning 500 times what the cashier of that supermarket earns. And think about who those cashiers are. And think about how we get greater equality, because actually, when decisions are made around the table for who gets what in that company, those with the lowest wages in that company are around the table with those with the highest. That is, in the end, what I was arguing for in the book. It's currently what Ed Miliband is arguing for in the Labour Party. And again, that will have an effect for black and minority ethnic communities in this country. Flexible parental leave. I'd like to see far greater scrutiny of the way that the internet works in relation to young people. I'm concerned about some of the advertising to young people that we see on television that I talk about in the book. I've touched on the culture that affects parts of my community in an inner city context. Again, mentoring. Boris Johnson could only recruit 21 people to mentor inner city boys. Given the scale of the challenge, the sort of statistics that we have, the urgency of that subject, the word pathetic is not even worth that number. He said he would find 1,000. We need some serious, it seems to me, if necessary, tax breaks and other things to put a real rocket under the ability to recruit mentors and have mentors working alongside young men in constituencies like mine. So I wanted, at this point in our history, to both say there are similarities to some of the debates we've had in the past, but there are profound differences. To say that, yes, some of them are about issues of equality, racism and discrimination. It seems to me there's an urgency around the issues that are to do with inequality. But actually, there are also a set of cultural evolutions to do with where we are now in 2011 that are posing profound challenges. And those are as much challenges to communities and individuals as they are to governments. Thank you very much.
David, let's start with something that often gets lost in the ether. Now, the riot started in Tottenham, and Tottenham has one of the highest rates of homelessness in London. It's seen in terms of employment in the bottom third in this country, and there has been a history of conflict with the police. What do you think were the reasons for the riots beginning?
Well, look, I think the reasons for the riots are many. And in the end, if you burn down someone's shop or you burn down their home, then you have to accept responsibility. No one forced you to do that. And I've raised some tough issues around the materialistic culture that we live in and absent fathers and issues like that. However, clearly, I am concerned about huge rates of unemployment in Tottenham and areas like Tottenham. And it's clear to me that if you are Bangladeshi or Pakistani, or if you are Black Caribbean, often the struggle to get employment, even though you are qualifying for that employment, is tougher in this economic market. And I think the government has to do a lot more on those issues. And we need serious regeneration in Tottenham. We've needed it for years, not just Tottenham, but Edmonton, because people's hopes get very depressed in this current environment. So I can't simplify this to one sentence, but clearly there are profound reasons. That's why I wrote a book about it, Out of the Ashes, to kind of cover off all of these issues.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. There's pieces of it that have received a lot of attention, specifically that comment around smacking and the influence that discipline and parenting could have had on the riots. I mean, do you think it really could have made that much of a difference?
I think that your viewers understand what I am saying. And what they say is they live in fear of a social worker knocking on their door and telling them or taking their kids because they smack their children. And I know in boroughs like Tower Hamlets and in Tottenham, if you're living on the 15th floor of a tower block, if there are 6, 7, 8, 9 of you in a 2-bedroom flat, if there are drugs, prostitution, needles beyond the door, then it's for you as parents to determine what the appropriate boundaries are. And I'm not suggesting that abuse, violence, battering, beating is at all ever acceptable. It's not acceptable. But I am saying that parents raise these issues with me in my constituency and constituencies like my constituency, and I think that they need to be listened to and heard, not condemned and judged and stigmatised for the way they raise their children.
No, it's a good point, and I guess it almost touches on the debate of what is good parenting, and part of that is discipline, but there's a whole host of other issues.
And love's what matters, and a nurturing environment. And I'm really grateful for the environment that I have. But it was tough love sometimes. It had to be, growing up in Tottenham in the 1980s.
I remember when we interviewed you last time and you were talking about your faith-based childhood and growing up in a faith-based household. Now, it's interesting that faith seems to have moved into the background in society in the broader sense. Now, in the myriad of reasons that could be responsible for this upheaval, do you think that may have played some part?
Well, I am a person of faith. I'm very grateful for the role that faith played in my life. It plays an active role in the lives of many, many of my constituents. We live in a more secular society that's diverse, and I've known many people of no faith that are as committed to social justice, as committed to improving a lot of others as I am, certainly, and as many in my community who have faith. But I don't like sometimes the shrill, secular disposition that is disparaging of people of faith, that treats them like they're stupid or irrelevant, that sometimes don't fund their organisation even though they're trying to reach out beyond just those with their faith background. And I certainly recognise from my own upbringing that, you know, where the money's coming from to pay the meter, you need to pray. So again, that's the tradition that I come from.
Yeah, I mean, faith is one way in which you can get values, or a set of values, and the liberal or progressive interpretation of those, or progressive faith-based values, it helps you enormously. But you can also get those values from other places, and I would agree with you. I mean, but where are we getting our values in modern society? I guess that's a question to answer, isn't it? And I think you alluded to some degree to that.
Well, I am deeply worried about the rabid individualism that we see in this society, about greed, about materialism, consumerism that puts trainers and hip-hop before what is in your heart, what is in your soul, what is in your brain, the way that this is pumped day after day at our children. And in my book, I raise, you know, real concerns about modern television and technology, and I think it's not on the side of parents, and I think that we need to wake up to this and get real about this, because it connects a hyper-liberal individualism in the economy with that culturally, and I think it's a real problem. This me, myself and I, rights-based culture. No one is entitled to anything. You have to give, you have to work hard, you have to support others and bring others up around you, and I think that remains a huge challenge today in 2011.
I think one of the things you're doing to tackle this challenge is of course trying to bring it to the public's attention, and I think that's fantastic and commendable. What else are you doing locally to try to bring forward a fight back?
Well, you know, there's lots going on in Tottenham that doesn't get the news. Wonderful youth groups, wonderful projects run by faith groups and others, schemes that are not reliant solely on public funding, actually, often a hand-to-mouth to make things happen, and I would support all of those things. We need wider regeneration in Tottenham. It looks like we're getting some money coming in to support the stadium. I hope some of that money can be used as a community chest for other initiatives. They're desperately in need.
Sure. And a final point, your book is now out, and I believe all of the proceeds are going to charity, local charities in Tottenham.
That's right.
So please go out there, everybody, and try to get yourself a copy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks.